Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I need to say this up front so you understand I'm not spinning some campfire tale. I attended Northern Arizona University in the fall of 2022, and I used Walnut Canyon the way most students use a gym, except mine came with a view. The trail system sits close enough to campus that you can finish an afternoon class and still catch an hour of daylight on the rim. If you're from Flagstaff, you learn early to pack a headlamp and an extra layer. The temperature doesn't just drop when the sun goes down, it plummets, sometimes 20 degrees in under an hour. Late September that year, 4 of us decided to squeeze in the Island Trail loop after our last Thursday class. We had maybe 90 minutes before the visitor center locked its gates for the night. I'd hiked that route at least a dozen times. I knew the paved sections, the metal staircases, the viewing platforms where tourists took photos of the cliff dwellings. I thought I also knew which informal side paths were just shortcuts worn in by locals, trails that reconnected to the official route within a few hundred feet. I was wrong about that. Wrong enough that I don't trust unmarked trails anymore, no matter how well traveled they look. Our group was me, Jade, Liam, and Quinn. I'm the one who actually reads the trail maps and carries a compass I know how to use. Jade's the practical one. She keeps a first aid kit in her pack and took a wilderness medicine course over the summer. Liam's strong, played football in high school, but he's not great on uneven terrain where every step requires balance. Quinn jokes through everything and showed up that day in worn-out sneakers because it's basically just stairs, right? We descended the island trail as the afternoon light turned amber. The metal steps rang under our boots. Other hikers were already heading up, making the final push before closure. We passed them with nods, and I felt that comfortable urgency you get when you're cutting it close but not actually worried. At the bottom, we walked the loop past the Sinagua cliff dwellings, stayed behind the protective barriers, and didn't linger. The shadows in the canyon were already thick and blue. When we climbed back up, breathing hard from the elevation and the pace, we reached the top of the staircase where the official trail curves right toward the visitor center. But to the left, there was a narrow footpath threading along the rim through low scrub and pale limestone shelves. The dirt looked packed and fresh, like 20 people had walked it that same day. It aimed in the general direction of the parking lot, cutting across maybe a quarter-mile of rimland instead of following the paved switchback. "That'll save us 10 minutes, I said, pointing. "It looks like it meets back up near the lot." Nobody questioned it. The sun had already slipped below the western rim, and the air had gone from warm to jacket cold in the span of 5 minutes. The path looked obvious enough. We started walking. For the first few minutes, the shortcut felt fine. We could still hear the distant hum of Interstate 40, that constant white noise you stop noticing when you live in Flagstaff. The rim up there is mostly exposed rock with clusters of juniper and small oaks just starting to turn gold. The path stayed clear, winding between boulders and staying about 15 feet back from the canyon's edge. Then we walked past something that made Quinn stop talking mid-sentence. Behind a waist-high limestone outcrop, sheltered from the path by about 10 feet, lay a deer. Not the scattered remains you'd expect from a coyote kill or a mountain lion cache. This was arranged. The rib cage had been cleaned completely, each bone visible and white as if someone had taken a wire brush to it. The spine was intact, curved in its natural position. The hide had been peeled back in a single piece and folded beside the skeleton like a blanket someone had just removed. There was no blood in the dirt, no drag marks, no scuff patterns showing how the carcass had gotten there. And balanced on top of one of the exposed ribs, right in the center of the chest cavity, sat a smooth river rock about the size of my fist. It wasn't wedged in. It was placed, deliberately, like a paperweight holding down a document. I knelt down, staying a few feet back, and looked for tracks. I know enough to check for prints. Scat, fur caught on branches, anything that tells a story. On a patch of fine dust near the carcass, I found impressions. They started out looking human. Barefoot width, clear heel strike, visible toe definition. The prints led away from the deer in a line, heading deeper into the scrub. Then they got strange. After 3 or 4 normal steps, the angle of the foot changed. The toes began pointing inward, pigeon-toed, as if the person walking had started to turn their feet as they moved. 2 steps later, both feet were fully rotated, toes pointing inward at unnatural angles. And then for the next 6 or 7 steps, the toe arcs faced completely backward. The prints looked like someone had been walking toward us while actually moving away. I've seen people walk backward for fun, leaving reverse tracks. These weren't like that. The stride length stayed consistent. The depth of each impression showed normal weight transfer from heel to ball. The spacing suggested a forward walking rhythm, not the shorter, cautious steps of someone moving in reverse. "This is a ranger thing," Liam said, his voice tight. "Some kind of cleanup or research project." I looked for boot treads, tire tracks, anything official. I saw nothing but those wrong-facing prints trailing off into the brush. "We need to keep moving," Jade said quietly. Her voice had that forced calm people use when they're trying not to spook a group. "We need to get back on the real trail." None of us touched the rock on the rib cage. We didn't photograph it. We just started walking again, faster than before, and closer together. About 50 yards past the deer, I started noticing the sound. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was just that every time one of us took a step, something else took a step through the brush to our left. Same pace, same rhythm. When we paused to negotiate a tricky section of trail, it paused. When we sped up, it matched us. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, like a metronome clicking alongside us. I tried to get a clean look. I'd stop suddenly and pivot, hoping to catch whatever it was off guard. But every time, I only got partials, a vertical shape behind a tree trunk, a suggestion of shoulders behind a boulder, something tall standing perfectly still in the gaps between junipers. It never stepped into the open. It stayed in that last band of shadow where the evening light couldn't quite reach. We passed another patch of exposed dust. 2 more prints waited there, side by side, toes pointing backward again. No approach marks leading to them, no trail leading away. They were just there as if someone had stood in that spot for a moment and then vanished. "Don't step in them," Jade said. We gave the prints a wide berth. The thought of putting my boot down inside one of those impressions made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't articulate. Quinn hadn't made a joke in 10 minutes. That alone told me everyone else felt it too. This sense that we'd crossed some invisible boundary and something on the other side had noticed. I decided to test it because I needed something concrete, something that wasn't just my imagination running wild in the low light. I picked up a rock about the size of a softball from the trail edge, wound up, and hurled it hard into the scrub where I'd last heard movement. It landed with a muffled thump against brush and dirt. A heartbeat later, no more than that, a second rock came clicking back out of the same area. Not thrown hard, just tossed. A casual, sharp sound, like "here's yours back." There hadn't been time. Not enough time for someone to locate my rock in the brush, pick it up and throw it back. And the sound profile was identical. Same weight, same type of impact. It was as if my rock had been caught mid-flight and immediately returned. "Nope," Quinn said. "Nope, nope." Then he went quiet again. "Eyes forward," Jade said. "Don't look at it. Just walk." We did eyes forward. We focused on the trail, on our footing, on the growing glow of security lights visible ahead where the park's maintenance area backed up to the rim. That worked fine until Liam stepped on a hidden piece of basalt concealed under dried grass and his ankle rolled hard. Liam went down with a sound that made my stomach clench. Not a shout, just a sharp exhalation of real pain. Jade was beside him in seconds, pack already open, pulling out her first aid kit with the efficiency of someone who's done this before. She checked his foot for circulation, palpated the joint, wrapped it tight with an ace bandage, and gave him ibuprofen from a small bottle. "Don't test it yet," she said. "We're going to move you carefully." We did the math quickly. I'd take point and set the pace. Quinn would stay 10 steps behind me, as relay. Jade would support Liam's bad side and keep weight off the injured ankle. The plan was simple. No running, no splitting up, no stopping unless absolutely necessary. The thing in the brush adjusted to our new, slower pace like it had been training with us all season. If we paused, silence. If we took 3 steps, 3 steps echoed from the tree line. Once, when I spun around fast enough, I caught a shape that could have been a tall person standing motionless between 2 junipers. The proportions were wrong, though. The arms hung too low, the head tilted at an angle that didn't match any posture I recognized. It didn't duck or hide when I looked directly at it. It just held perfectly still until the fading light and my own doubting eyes lost the outline. We crossed another dust patch. 2 more prints waited there, side by side, toes facing backward. No trail leading in, no trail leading out. We stepped around them. The maintenance area appeared ahead, surrounded by chain link fence topped with barbed wire. Security lights had clicked on automatically, casting harsh white pools across stacked lumber and equipment. I could see a pale cinder block building, and one of those green utility carts the staff use on service roads. We reached the nearest gate, locked. A fat padlock hung from the chain. I rattled it once, then stopped because the sound felt too loud, too much like ringing a dinner bell. Inside the fence, everything looked normal and human and safe. Outside, in the tree line just beyond where the security lights reached, something stood and matched our position step for step. If I moved 2 steps right, the silhouette did too. At first glance, it read as human, a tall person in dark clothing. But the longer I looked, the more wrong the proportions felt. The arms hung lower than they should. The way the head turned suggested the neck attached higher on the back than anatomy allowed. A utility cart's electric whine cut through the silence. A staff member in his 40s rounded the far end of the fence onto the service road. He took in our situation immediately. 4 hikers at a locked gate, 1 injured, something lingering just outside the light. He didn't waste time with questions. He waved hard, pointing toward a service gate around the corner, and started moving. We started hobbling after him. That's the only word for it. Hobbling. Liam's adrenaline had worn off completely, and now the ankle was a throbbing problem that made him hiss with each step. As we moved, the silhouette outside the fence changed posture. It shifted from standing still to something ready, coiled. Then it broke into a run parallel to us. Maintaining a strict distance from the light line as if there was tape on the ground it refused to cross. But it didn't run right. The arm swing was off. The gait was too smooth, too effortless, eating ground in a way that looked strong without looking like it required any effort at all. It peeled off into the brush at the corner where the fence turned, disappearing. Liam lost it for a second, not screaming, but panic breathing in a way that made him sway. He dropped to one knee, hand on the ground. I lunged forward to grab his other arm. Something else got there first. I felt it before I saw it. A pressure on Liam's upper arm. A strong, steady push upward like someone helping him stand. Except the contact points were wrong. The grip had too much spread between the fingers. The touch was cold and the strength was undeniable, leaving pressure marks I could see forming even in the bad light. Liam lurched upward as if hauled by an invisible handle. He stared at me with wide, broken eyes. I shook my head. I had no explanation to offer him. The maintenance worker met us at the service gate, keys already in hand. He opened it, waved us through, locked it behind us, and kept his voice low and steady the way people who actually handle emergencies talk when they know how fast things can deteriorate. He didn't tell stories. He didn't lecture. He glanced at Liam's bandaged ankle, said good work on that, and gestured toward his cart. Get in. The only extra thing he did was point at the dust outside the fence as he swung the gate shut. 2 clean impressions marked the ground there, toes arcs pointing wrong again, facing back the way we'd come while the heels pointed toward us. Don't cut that trail, he said. People have been warned. Some things track you when you break the rules. That was it. No smile, no spooky tone, just a flat statement of fact. He drove us the back way to the parking lot, staying on service roads we didn't know existed. He parked beside the visitor center and watched while we got into our car. He kept watching until our headlights were on and we were pulling onto Walnut Canyon Road. He didn't wave. He didn't try to tell us more. I respect him for that. At home, Liam showered and sent a photo to our group chat even though none of us had asked for one. He'd developed a bruise on his upper arm, forming in the distinct shape of a handprint, except the fingers were long bars of pressure that didn't match anyone in our group. Jade measured it against her own hand because that's who she is. Methodical, needing data. The finger spans were wrong, too wide, too long. The thumb placement was off. That bruise took nearly 3 weeks to fade, longer than it should have based on how deep the blood had pooled under his skin. His ankle healed faster. We went back the next day. Not to that trail, to the visitor center, to ask casual questions about hours and closures in a normal, friendly way. The front desk staff told us the posted times, reminded us to stay on marked trails, and mentioned that rangers do occasional patrols but can't cover every area. We didn't mention the deer. I don't know why. Maybe because saying it out loud would have made it sound like we were telling a story for attention. None of us wanted that. We hiked the official route that day. We didn't take shortcuts, even the ones that obviously just cut off a gentle curve and rejoined the main trail 20 yards later. We didn't see anything unusual. The wind made normal grass sounds. Our boots scuffed rock like boots should. The only other people we encountered were a retired couple from Iowa who asked where the restrooms were. It was just a park again. But Liam kept that ace bandage in his truck afterward. Quinn bought real hiking boots. Jade started carrying 2 headlamps so she could loan one out if needed. And I stopped cutting trails anywhere, even when I'm absolutely certain they just reconnect around a single tree. I know the erosion argument for staying on marked paths, and I believed it before. But now I follow the rules because they seem designed to keep something else from noticing you. Call that superstition if you want. I call it risk management. I've thrown rocks in the woods dozens of times before and since. I've never had one thrown back from the same spot, same weight, same sound, in the same second. I've seen animal tracks that looked strange due to erosion or overlay. I've never seen footprints with toes facing backward that couldn't be explained by someone literally walking in reverse. I've helped friends up off the ground more times than I can count. I have never felt a stranger's hand reach them before mine did. I don't use certain words lightly, and I won't pretend to understand what they mean to people whose traditions and knowledge systems aren't mine. I'll just say the behavior fit the pattern that students around Flagstaff talk about when they share trail warnings. Pacing, mirroring, matching steps, staying just out of clean view until the moment it becomes conveniently inhuman. You can call it a trespasser messing with us. You can call it a tall trail runner with unusual gait. You can call it a trick of distance, stress, and failing light. Pick whatever explanation helps you sleep at night. I'm not here to argue or convince you. I'm here to tell you what happened and what I learned. A 5-minute shortcut near closing time isn't a shortcut if it puts you somewhere a maintenance worker has to extract you from through a service gate. If you hike near Walnut Canyon and you see a narrow track along the rim that looks like it'll save you time, don't take it. Use the official trail and be bored for an extra 10 minutes. Bring a headlamp even if you swear you won't need it. Wear boots that won't fold your ankle. Travel in groups. And if you were the tall outline pacing us that evening in late September 2022, or if you're anything like it, I have one simple request. Let's not meet. After 37 years of military service, retirement hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. The silence was deafening. No morning reveille, no mission briefings, no purpose driving me from bed each dawn. My wife Amanda watched me pace our house like a caged animal for 3 months before she made her suggestion. "We're going traveling," she announced one Tuesday morning, setting down her coffee cup with finality. "And we're going hiking." The word hiking struck me with the same enthusiasm I might feel for dental surgery without anesthesia. After decades of forced marches through hostile terrain, the idea of voluntarily trudging through wilderness for pleasure seemed like the height of masochism. But marriage teaches you that certain battles aren't worth fighting, especially when your wife has that particular gleam in her eye that says negotiation is off the table. Amanda had always been the outdoorsy type. While I'd been deployed in deserts and jungles where nature actively tried to kill you, she'd been earning her doctorate in biology, studying ecosystems with the kind of passion I'd once reserved for tactical manuals. Her enthusiasm for swamps and bug-infested forests was inversely proportional to my desire to avoid them at all costs. "If we're going to do this," I told her, "I need something to make it worthwhile." That's when I discovered my new obsession: cryptid hunting. Florida, as it turns out, is a treasure trove of unexplained creatures and local legends. From the Fook monster sightings in the Panhandle to the bizarre Beast of Busco reports near the coast, the state seemed to harbor more mysterious creatures per square mile than anywhere else in the country. I'd always been a researcher by nature. Military intelligence had trained me to dig deep, to question official narratives, to look for what others missed. Cryptids gave me a mission again, a purpose that transformed Amanda's hiking expeditions from torture into tactical operations. The more I read, the more fascinated I became. These weren't just campfire stories told by drunken hunters. Many reports came from law enforcement officers, park rangers, biologists, credible people with no reason to fabricate encounters with impossible creatures. The consistency across decades of sightings, the similar behavioral patterns described by witnesses who'd never met each other, the physical evidence that couldn't be easily explained away. It was Amanda who suggested we start with the Everglades. Her grandfather, Coleman, had spent a week there in 1987, documenting his journey through detailed journal entries that she'd inherited after his death. The old man had been methodical, recording GPS coordinates, weather conditions, wildlife sightings, even the brands of camping equipment that worked best in the humid environment. We could retrace his route, she said, spreading his yellowed notebook across our kitchen table. Day by day, campsite by campsite, I studied Coleman's careful handwriting, his sketched maps, his observations about the unique challenges of Everglades exploration. The man had been thorough, almost military in his precision. But as I read deeper into his entries, I noticed something else. References to unusual sounds, strange impressions in the mud, feeling watched. Coleman had been hunting something too, though he'd never named it directly. The Cherokee legends speak of the Wampus Cat, a creature that defies natural law. 6 legs, burning green eyes, the ability to hypnotize prey from impossible distances. According to tribal lore, it could move faster than light itself, appearing and vanishing like smoke. The stories painted it as part mountain lion, part supernatural entity, part vengeful spirit. Most cryptozoologists dismiss the Wampus Cat as pure mythology, but I'd learned in the military that legends often contained kernels of truth. The earliest documented sightings dated back to the 1920s in North Carolina, where something had been killing cattle in ways that defied explanation. Claw marks too large for any known predator, bite patterns that suggested impossible jaw structures, the complete absence of typical feeding behavior. The reports had migrated south over the decades, following the Appalachian chain down through Georgia and into Florida. What struck me most was the evolution of the stories. In Cherokee tradition, the Wampus Cat was associated with women, either as a protector spirit inhabited by a brave warrior's wife, or as a hybrid creature born from the union of female human and demonic feline. Amanda found the whistling aspect particularly intriguing. Most big cats produce roars, growls, hisses, and purrs, but they don't whistle, except mountain lions, which can produce an eerie, almost human-like whistle when calling to mates. We spent hours listening to recordings online, trying to distinguish between documented big cat vocalizations and the otherworldly sounds described by Wampus Cat witnesses. The Everglades presented the perfect hunting ground. Over 1.5 million acres of sawgrass marshes, mangrove forests, and pine islands created countless hiding places for creatures that preferred to remain hidden. The ecosystem was already so alien to most humans that one more impossible predator wouldn't seem out of place. Coleman's journal entries from his 3rd day proved most interesting. He'd camped on a pine island roughly 8 miles southwest of the main visitor center, a spot accessible only by canoe through a maze of narrow channels. His notes described persistent vocalizations unlike any documented Florida panther calls, and the distinct impression of being observed by intelligent eyes. We planned our expedition for late October, when the crushing summer heat would give way to more tolerable temperatures. I assembled our gear with military precision: GPS units, digital cameras with night vision capabilities, audio recording equipment, camping supplies rated for extended wetland exposure, and enough bug spray to stock a small army. Amanda handled the biological preparation, researching current wildlife populations, identifying potential food sources for large predators, mapping territorial ranges of documented big cats in the region. Her scientific approach balanced my more intuitive hunting instincts. But as our departure date approached, I found myself waking in the pre-dawn hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Coleman's final journal entry from the Everglades. Written in shaky handwriting that seemed unlike his usual steady script, it contained only one line: "Some things are better left undisturbed." October 28th found us setting up camp on Coleman's Pine Island, as the sun painted the Everglades in shades of gold and crimson. The isolation struck me immediately. No sounds of human civilization, no aircraft overhead, nothing but the whisper of wind through sawgrass and the distant splash of something large moving through water. Amanda had been right about the mosquitoes. They descended on us the moment we stepped out of our canoe, forming clouds so thick they seemed to dim the daylight. No amount of repellent seemed to deter them completely. They found every exposed inch of skin with the persistence of heat-seeking missiles. As darkness fell, the Everglades transformed into something primordial. Sounds that seemed innocent during daylight took on sinister undertones. The splash of a jumping fish became the movement of something massive just beneath the surface. The call of a night heron morphed into the cry of something that shouldn't exist. We began our hunt around 8 p.m., following game trails that wound through the sawgrass like ancient highways. I'd loaded several mountain lion recordings onto my phone, mating calls, territorial vocalizations, distress sounds that might attract a curious predator. The plan was simple: play the recordings at regular intervals while moving through areas Coleman had marked as active. For the first 2 hours, we documented nothing but routine swamp life. Frogs created a constant background chorus, occasionally interrupted by the prehistoric bellow of an alligator in the distance. Spiders the size of dinner plates watched us from intricate webs spanning the trail. Once a great blue heron exploded from the reeds directly in front of us, its massive wingspan and harsh cry making Amanda jump so violently she nearly dropped our recording equipment. But as we moved deeper into the island's interior, following a narrow trail that Coleman had marked with an X on his hand-drawn map, the atmosphere began to change. The frog chorus that had been constant suddenly ceased, as if someone had thrown a switch. Even the insects seemed to grow quieter. Amanda noticed it first. "Listen," she whispered, grabbing my arm. I stopped, straining my ears. At first I heard nothing but our own breathing, and the distant rustle of wind through vegetation. Then, just at the edge of perception, came a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. Whistling. Not the sharp, piercing whistle of a human, or the mechanical tweet of electronics, but something organic and wild. It rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost musical, but with an undertone that suggested enormous lung capacity. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, shifting direction even as we listened. We stood frozen for nearly 10 minutes, straining to locate the source. The whistling continued intermittently, sometimes close enough to seem just beyond the next bend in the trail, other times so distant it might have been imagination. "Could be a bird," Amanda whispered, but her voice carried doubt. "What kind of bird whistles like that?" She had no answer. In all her years of field research, she'd never encountered anything that produced sounds like what we were hearing. The closest comparison might be certain whale songs, but we were miles from the ocean in the middle of a freshwater ecosystem. I decided to respond. Cupping my hands around my mouth, I attempted to mimic the whistling pattern we'd been hearing. My human lungs couldn't match the volume or the haunting quality, but I managed a reasonable approximation of the rising and falling tones. The response was immediate and terrifying. Something large crashed through the vegetation roughly 50 yards to our left, moving with such speed and force that entire saplings snapped like matchsticks. The whistling ceased abruptly, replaced by a sound I can only describe as breathing deep, measured inhalations and exhalations that suggested a chest cavity far larger than any known Florida wildlife. We remained motionless, barely daring to breathe ourselves. Whatever had responded to my call was close now, perhaps 30 yards away, hidden by the dense sawgrass but definitely aware of our presence. I could feel it watching us, evaluating, deciding. Amanda's hand found mine in the darkness, her grip tight with fear. We stood like statues for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, listening to that rhythmic breathing and feeling the weight of invisible eyes upon us. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, our observer departed. No dramatic crashing through undergrowth this time, just the gradual cessation of that heavy breathing and the slow return of normal swamp sounds. The frogs resumed their chorus tentatively, as if they too had been waiting for the all-clear signal. We made our way back to camp in silence, both lost in our own thoughts about what we'd encountered. As we prepared for bed, Amanda finally spoke. "That wasn't in any of my field guides." I nodded, checking our tent zippers for the third time. Coleman was right. There's something out here. Dawn brought little relief from the previous night's tension. As Amanda prepared breakfast over our camp stove, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of movement that might indicate we were still being watched. The cheerful morning sounds of birds and insects seemed almost mocking after the ominous encounter in the darkness. Over coffee, I shared what I'd learned about the Everglades predator population. Information that had taken on new significance after our midnight visitor. The ecosystem harbored dangers that most visitors never considered, threats that moved through the water and vegetation with deadly efficiency. "You know about the pythons," I said. spreading out a map of reported snake sightings. But most people don't understand the scope of the problem. The Burmese python invasion represented one of the most successful biological conquests in recorded history, starting from a few dozen escaped or released pets in the 1980s. The population had exploded to an estimated 100,000 individuals scattered throughout the Everglades. These weren't the relatively harmless snakes most people imagined when they heard python. Burmese pythons regularly exceeded 15 feet in length, with the largest specimen on record measuring over 19 feet and weighing 125 pounds. What made them particularly terrifying was their hunting strategy. Unlike venomous snakes that struck and retreated, pythons were constrictors. They grabbed prey with backward curving teeth, then wrapped their muscular coils around the victim and squeezed until the heart stopped beating. They could remain motionless for hours, partially submerged in murky water, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The rangers estimate they've eliminated over 90% of the native mammal population in some areas, I continued, pointing to sections of the map marked in red. Raccoons, opossums, bobcats, anything small enough to be overpowered has virtually disappeared from these zones. Amanda studied the map with growing unease. Our campsite sat squarely in the middle of a high-density python zone, surrounded by waterways that provided perfect hunting grounds for aquatic ambush predators. But the pythons weren't the only concern. American alligators ruled the waterways with prehistoric authority, some specimens reaching lengths of 14 feet or more. Unlike their smaller cousins in other states, Everglades alligators showed little fear of humans, particularly during mating season when territorial aggression reached peak levels. The night before, we'd heard several alligator bellows in the distance, deep, rumbling calls that vibrated through the water and into the ground beneath our feet. Those calls could carry for miles, serving as both mating advertisements and territorial warnings. Any large predator in the area would know exactly where every alligator was located at any given time. Which brought me to the most disturbing realization of all. Whatever we encountered last night, I told Amanda, it wasn't afraid of any of this. She looked up from her coffee, understanding dawning in her eyes. Think about it, I continued. We're in an area crawling with 19-foot pythons and massive alligators. Any normal animal, even a large mammal like a black bear, would be constantly alert, constantly listening for threats. But our visitor last night moved with confidence. It approached our position, evaluated us as potential threats or prey, and departed on its own terms. The implications were sobering. We were dealing with something that considered itself the apex predator in an ecosystem filled with monsters. As we broke camp and prepared for our second day of exploration, I found myself paying closer attention to the environmental details Coleman had recorded in his journal. His notes described an unusual absence of typical wildlife sounds in certain areas, game trails that seemed to end abruptly for no apparent reason, and the consistent discovery of partially consumed prey that showed unfamiliar feeding patterns. Reading between the lines, Coleman had been documenting the hunting grounds of something that didn't belong in the known food chain. Our plan for the day involved exploring a series of hammocks, slightly elevated areas of hardwood forest that rose like islands from the surrounding marsh. These hammocks often served as refuges for wildlife during high water periods, concentrating animals in relatively small areas and creating ideal hunting opportunities for large predators. As we paddled our canoe through narrow channels toward the first hammock, Amanda pointed out something that made my blood pressure spike. "Look at that," she said, indicating a partially submerged log about 20 feet ahead. I looked and for a moment saw nothing unusual. Then the log moved slightly, revealing the telltale ridged back and prehistoric eyes of an American alligator. This one was massive, probably 12 feet long, with a head the size of a small boat. It watched our approach with the patient malevolence of a creature that had been perfecting the art of killing for millions of years. We gave it a wide berth, but the encounter reminded me that we were visitors in a world where humans ranked somewhere near the bottom of the food chain. Everything here was bigger, more aggressive, and infinitely better adapted to the hostile environment than we were. By the time we reached the first hammock, the sun had climbed high enough to create a greenhouse effect in the humid air. Sweat poured down our faces despite the relatively mild temperature, and the bug spray we'd applied that morning had long since been diluted by perspiration and swamp water. But as we pulled our canoe up onto the muddy shore of the hammock, I noticed something that made me forget about the heat and insects entirely. Tracks. The prints in the mud were unlike anything I'd encountered in 37 years of military service across 6 continents. At first glance, they resembled human footprints: 5 toes, a distinguishable heel, an arch structure that suggested bipedal locomotion. But the scale was all wrong. These tracks measured at least 18 inches in length and 8 inches in width, pressed deep enough into the moist earth to indicate a creature weighing several hundred pounds. Amanda knelt beside the clearest impression, her scientific training overriding her obvious fear. "The toe placement is wrong for any known primate," she said, using a ruler from her field kit to document the measurements. "And look at this. The depth suggests a plantigrade stance, walking on the entire sole of the foot rather than just the toes." I studied the track from a tactical perspective, noting details that suggested intelligence rather than mere animal behavior. The stride length was consistent with deliberate movement rather than the varied gait of a creature simply wandering through its territory. More disturbing was the direction. The tracks led directly toward the interior of the hammock, following what appeared to be the most efficient route through the dense vegetation. "It knows the terrain," I muttered, following the trail with my eyes. "This isn't random movement. It's got specific destinations in mind." We found more tracks as we ventured deeper into the hammock, each one confirming our worst fears about the size and intelligence of whatever had made them. Some prints showed clear evidence of deliberate foot placement, stepping precisely on fallen logs or solid ground to minimize noise. Others had been partially obscured, as if the creature had attempted to hide its trail by dragging vegetation across the impressions. The hammock itself felt different from the surrounding marsh. The canopy created a cathedral-like atmosphere, filtering the harsh sunlight into dappled green shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Massive oak trees draped with Spanish moss formed natural corridors through the undergrowth, while palmetto fronds created walls of vegetation that blocked sightlines beyond a few yards in any direction. It was perfect stalking terrain. Amanda documented everything with scientific precision, photographing tracks from multiple angles, collecting soil samples, measuring stride lengths and angles of progression. But I could see the fear growing in her eyes with each new discovery. This wasn't the controlled observation of laboratory specimens. We were documenting evidence of a predator that might be documenting us right back. The deeper we traveled into the hammock, the more apparent it became that we weren't the first researchers to visit this location. We found the remnants of at least 3 previous campsites, identifiable by fire rings, tent pad clearings, and the scattered remains of scientific equipment. What disturbed me most was the apparent haste with which these camps had been abandoned. Expensive gear left behind, tents collapsed but not properly packed, supplies scattered as if their owners had departed with extreme urgency. At one site, Amanda discovered a field notebook wedged beneath a fallen branch. The entries were illegible due to water damage, but the final legible date was from 3 years earlier. The last readable words sent a chill down my spine. "Growing bolder each night. Recommend immediate evacuation." By afternoon, the oppressive atmosphere of the hammock was affecting both of us. Conversation dropped to whispers, and we found ourselves constantly looking over our shoulders. The normal sounds of wildlife had diminished to an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional crack of a breaking branch or the splash of something large moving through nearby water. As we prepared to leave the hammock and return to our campsite, Amanda made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath a dense cluster of palmetto fronds, she found a cache. It wasn't a natural collection of debris or the random accumulation of flood-deposited materials. Someone or something had deliberately gathered objects and concealed them in this location. The cache contained items that had clearly been taken from human visitors over a period of years: camping equipment, scientific instruments, personal belongings, even what appeared to be articles of clothing. But it was the organization that terrified me most. The items weren't randomly piled together. They'd been sorted by type and size, arranged in patterns that suggested systematic collection and evaluation. Cameras were grouped together in one area, camping gear in another, clothing items carefully folded and stacked according to size. It looked like the inventory system of an intelligence analyst studying enemy equipment. "It's learning about us," Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my mind racing through the implications. Whatever we were dealing with wasn't just a large unknown animal. It was intelligent enough to study human behavior patterns, collect and analyze human artifacts, and modify its own behavior based on that analysis. The military tactician in me recognized the strategic intelligence of the cache location, hidden but accessible, positioned to monitor one of the main travel routes through the hammock, close enough to water for easy escape but elevated enough to avoid flooding. This wasn't the random hoarding of a confused animal. It was the forward observation post of something that understood human psychology and habits. As we retreated from the cache and made our way back toward our canoe, I realized that our research expedition had become something entirely different. We weren't hunting a cryptid anymore. We were being hunted ourselves. Darkness fell across the Everglades like a heavy curtain, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of shadows and whispered threats. We'd returned to our campsite on the Pine Island just as the sun touched the horizon, both of us shaken by the discoveries in the hammock, but determined to continue our investigation. The cache had changed everything. No longer could we dismiss our midnight visitor as a case of mistaken identity or overactive imagination. The systematic collection and organization of human artifacts indicated intelligence, planning, and most disturbing of all, a long-term interest in human behavior patterns. I'd spent the remainder of the afternoon studying Coleman's journal entries with new understanding. His notes about feeling watched and unusual wildlife behavior took on sinister significance when viewed through the lens of our discoveries. The old man hadn't been imagining things. He'd been under systematic observation by something that understood the value of gathering intelligence before making contact. As we prepared our evening meal, Amanda pointed out something that made my tactical instincts scream warnings. "The bird sounds are wrong," she said, pausing in her meal preparation to listen to the gathering dusk chorus. She was right. After 2 days in the Everglades, we'd grown accustomed to the complex symphony of wildlife that emerged each evening. Herons called from distant rookeries. Nightbirds began their hunting songs. Frogs and insects created a layered background of sound that should have been reaching its peak as full darkness approached. Instead, we heard only scattered, nervous calls, the kind of sounds animals made when a major predator was in the vicinity. I checked our equipment one final time. GPS units fully charged, cameras ready, extra batteries distributed between our packs, emergency beacon easily accessible. If we were going to make contact with whatever was sharing this island with us, I wanted every advantage technology could provide. We began our patrol around 9 p.m., following a circuit that would take us to each area where Coleman had reported unusual activity. Unlike the previous night's tentative exploration, this time we moved with purpose. If something was studying us, we needed to learn about it before it decided we posed a threat that required elimination. The change in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Within minutes of leaving our campsite, we both felt the presence of our observer. Not a sound or movement we could identify, just the primordial awareness that comes from thousands of years of evolution. The feeling of being watched by something with predatory intent. Amanda carried the audio equipment while I navigated and maintained security. Every 50 yards we paused to play recordings of various big cat vocalizations, listening carefully for any response. For the first hour, our calls echoed unanswered across the dark water and rustling vegetation. Then, as we reached the northern tip of the island where Coleman had reported his most significant encounter, something answered. The sound that emerged from the darkness ahead was like nothing in any wildlife guide or audio database. It started as a low rumble, almost below the threshold of human hearing, then climbed through a series of tones that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. The final note was indeed a whistle, but with harmonic overtones that suggested vocal cords of impossible size and complexity. "God in heaven," Amanda whispered, her scientific composure finally cracking. The response had come from directly ahead, perhaps 40 yards away in a dense cluster of cabbage palms and sawgrass. But as the sound died away, I realized our observer had accomplished something that should have been impossible. It had perfectly mimicked the mountain lion call we'd played, then modified it into something entirely its own. I raised my hand for silence, straining to hear any indication of movement. For several minutes, the Everglades held its breath. Even the insects seemed to pause their constant buzzing, as if the entire ecosystem was waiting to see what would happen next. When the attack came, it wasn't what either of us expected. Instead of a direct assault, our observer began a campaign of psychological warfare that demonstrated intelligence far beyond anything we were prepared to encounter. It started with sounds, not the dramatic crashing through vegetation that might indicate a large animal's approach, but subtle audio cues designed to create confusion and fear. breathing. Deep, measured inhalations and exhalations coming from multiple directions around our position. Sometimes the sounds seemed close enough to touch, other times distant enough to be imagination. But the pattern was unmistakable. We were being surrounded. Amanda grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin with unconscious fear. I drew her closer, trying to present a unified front to whatever was circling us in the darkness. Then came the projectiles. The first chunk of rotting wood struck a tree trunk 6 feet to my left, hitting with enough force to scatter bark fragments across our position. The impact was followed immediately by another projectile from our right flank, then a third from behind us. "Move," I hissed, pulling Amanda toward what appeared to be a gap in our surrounding observers. But as we tried to withdraw, the barrage intensified. Chunks of decomposing logs, fist-sized stones, handfuls of mud and vegetation, all hurled with accuracy that indicated detailed knowledge of our exact position despite the complete darkness. Whatever was throwing this debris could see us clearly while remaining invisible itself. The projectiles weren't random harassment. They were strategically placed to hurt us in a specific direction, cutting off certain escape routes while leaving others apparently open. I recognized the tactic from military training, channeling enemy movement into a predetermined kill zone. We were being maneuvered, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. I forced myself to move slowly and deliberately. Running would only trigger a pursuit response from whatever was hunting us. Our only chance lay in convincing our stalker that we weren't prey animals ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "Back toward the creek bed," I whispered to Amanda. "Stay low. Move like you're not afraid." It was like walking through a minefield while blindfolded. Each step carried the risk of triggering an escalation from harassment to direct attack. The projectiles continued to fall around us, each one precisely aimed to maintain psychological pressure without causing actual injury. The intelligence behind this campaign was more frightening than any mindless animal assault would have been. We were dealing with something that understood the human psyche well enough to exploit our deepest fears. The creek bed offered temporary relief from the projectile assault, but I knew we weren't safe. The depression in the landscape provided concealment from our stalker's line of sight, but it also created a natural choke point where we could be easily trapped if our observer decided to escalate beyond psychological warfare. Amanda was breathing hard, her scientific composure completely shattered by the methodical nature of the attack. "What does it want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle gurgle of water flowing through the creek. I didn't have an answer. Military training had prepared me for human enemies with understandable motivations: territorial control, resource acquisition, ideological dominance. But this encounter fell outside every tactical framework I'd ever learned. We were dealing with intelligence without recognizable purpose, strategy without apparent goal. The harassment had stopped the moment we reached the creek bed, which suggested our stalker was reevaluating its approach. In the sudden silence, I became aware of details that had been obscured by the chaos of falling debris. The night air carried a stench unlike anything I'd encountered in 3 decades of military service across every climate zone on Earth. It wasn't the clean musk of large mammals or the sharp ammonia scent of reptile waste. This smell suggested decay and wildness, organic matter in various stages of decomposition mixed with something alive and massive. The odor waxed and waned as if its source was moving, circling our position while remaining invisible in the darkness. "We need to move," I told Amanda. "This position is too exposed." The main trail lay 50 yards southeast of our current location, accessible through a gap in the vegetation that would require us to cross open ground for approximately 30 seconds. Under normal circumstances, it would be a routine movement, but with an unknown predator tracking our every step, those 30 seconds might as well be 30 hours. I was trying to plan our next move when Amanda grabbed my shoulder with enough force to bruise. "Look," she breathed, pointing toward a cluster of cabbage palms about 20 yards upstream. At first, I saw nothing but dark vegetation swaying in the night breeze. Then my eyes adjusted, and I understood why Amanda's grip had tightened to the point of pain. Eyes. 2 large reflective orbs catching and amplifying the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy. They were positioned at least 8 feet off the ground, which ruled out every known Florida predator, except perhaps a very large bear standing on its hind legs. But bears didn't move with the fluid silence I was observing. and bears didn't engage in the kind of systematic psychological warfare we'd been experiencing. The eyes held our position for several minutes, unblinking and utterly alien in their patient assessment. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, cataloged and evaluated by intelligence that operated according to rules I couldn't begin to understand. Then, without warning, our observer stepped forward. The movement was smooth and deliberate, revealing a silhouette that belonged in nightmares rather than any ecosystem on Earth. Bipedal but massive, with proportions that suggested immense physical power combined with surprising grace. Even in the poor light, I could see that this creature moved with the confidence of something that had never encountered a threat it couldn't handle. Amanda made a small sound of terror that was immediately answered by a low rumble from our observer. Not aggressive, exactly, but unmistakably communicative. The creature was acknowledging our presence and establishing the parameters of our encounter. It was studying us the same way we'd been trying to study it. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and prey regarded each other across 20 yards of dark water. I could feel Amanda trembling beside me, her biological training warring with primitive fear as she tried to categorize something that defied every known taxonomic framework. The standoff ended when our observer turned slightly, revealing a profile that made my military experience seem suddenly irrelevant. This wasn't just an unknown animal. It was something that represented a fundamental challenge to humanity's position in the natural order. Moving with deliberate slowness, I reached for Amanda's hand and began backing toward the gap that led to the main trail. Our observer tracked our movement but made no attempt to follow, apparently content to maintain visual contact while we retreated. We'd made it halfway to the trail opening when everything went wrong. My foot caught on something in the darkness. A root, a fallen branch, some obstacle that hadn't been there during our approach. I stumbled, and Amanda's attempt to catch me sent us both crashing into the shallow water with a splash that echoed across the silent swamp like a gunshot. The response was immediate and terrifying. Our observer erupted into motion, covering the 20 yards between us in what seemed like 3 or 4 massive strides. I caught a glimpse of something enormous bearing down on us, moving with speed that defied physics for something of its apparent size. "Run!" I shouted, hauling Amanda to her feet and pushing her toward the trail opening. We crashed through the vegetation like panicked deer, abandoning all pretense of stealth in favor of pure speed. Behind us, I could hear our pursuer following with the heavy, measured pace of something that knew it could overtake us whenever it chose. But it didn't choose to. Instead, it maintained pursuit at exactly the distance needed to keep us in a state of terror without actually catching us. When we stumbled, it slowed. When we found our footing and picked up speed, it accelerated just enough to keep the sound of its approach audible behind us. We were being herded again, driven along a specific route toward some predetermined destination. The realization should have been paralyzing, but military training finally kicked in. If our pursuer wanted us to follow this particular path, the worst thing we could do was cooperate. I grabbed Amanda and pulled her off the main trail, crashing through a wall of palmetto fronds toward what appeared to be a game trail heading in the opposite direction. The change in our route triggered an immediate escalation. Our pursuer unleashed a vocalization that made our earlier audio encounters seem like whispers. The sound started somewhere below human hearing and climbed through octaves that shouldn't have been possible for any terrestrial creature. It was communication, warning, and threat, all wrapped into a noise that seemed to shake the ground beneath our feet. We ignored the warning and kept running. The alternative route proved to be exactly what I'd hoped. A narrow path that wound through dense vegetation toward the canoe landing where we'd left our boat. If we could reach the water, we might have a chance of escaping to the main visitor area where other humans and artificial lighting would provide some measure of safety. Our pursuer had other ideas. As we neared the landing, something massive crashed through the vegetation directly ahead of us, blocking our access to the canoe. We skidded to a halt, trapped between our original stalker and what appeared to be a second creature that had been waiting in ambush. For a moment that felt like the end of everything. We stood frozen in the darkness between 2 unknown predators that had demonstrated tactical coordination beyond anything in the animal kingdom. Then Amanda spotted our salvation. "The emergency trail," she gasped, pointing toward a barely visible break in the vegetation that led toward the park's perimeter fence. It was our last option, and we took it. The emergency trail proved to be exactly what its name suggested, a narrow, poorly maintained path intended for use only when normal routes became impassable. It wound through the densest sections of vegetation, crossed several water obstacles that soaked us to the waist, and seemed to double back on itself numerous times before finally emerging near the main visitor parking area. We covered the distance in record time, driven by the constant awareness that our pursuers were still tracking our movements through the darkness behind us. Several times I heard the distinctive sound of something large forcing its way through vegetation parallel to our route, maintaining contact while allowing us to believe we were escaping. It wasn't until we stumbled into the bright artificial lighting of the visitor center that our stalkers finally abandoned their pursuit. The transition from primordial darkness to modern civilization was so abrupt it felt like stepping between worlds. Amanda collapsed on a bench outside the center, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and residual terror. I checked the digital display on my GPS unit and discovered that our escape had taken nearly 3 hours. We'd been under direct observation and systematic harassment from approximately 11 p.m. until almost 2 a.m. "We have to report this," Amanda said when she'd recovered enough to speak coherently. "But report what? Exactly." "That we'd encountered an unknown bipedal creature of enormous size and apparent intelligence. That it had demonstrated tactical awareness and psychological manipulation beyond anything in documented animal behavior. That it had herded us along specific routes while maintaining pursuit for over 3 hours." I understood Amanda's scientific impulse to document and report our discoveries, but my military experience suggested a more cautious approach. Without physical evidence beyond questionable footprints and our personal testimony, any report we filed would likely be dismissed as the hysteria of inexperienced campers who'd encountered a black bear in poor lighting conditions. We spent the remainder of the night in the parking lot, dozing fitfully in our rental car while watching the tree line for any sign of movement. As dawn broke across the Everglades, the events of the previous night began to seem almost surreal, like memories from someone else's nightmare rather than our own experience. But I couldn't shake the conviction that we needed to return to the hammock where we'd discovered the cache. "I'm going back out there," I told Amanda over coffee at a nearby restaurant. Alone this time. Her reaction was predictably negative, but I explained my reasoning. Our midnight encounter had demonstrated that whatever we'd found was intelligent enough to modify its behavior when facing multiple humans. A single person might be perceived as less threatening, more likely to be observed rather than actively deterred. Besides, military training had taught me to verify intelligence reports through multiple sources. One encounter could be explained away as misperception or coincidence. But if I could gather additional evidence, photographs, audio recordings, more detailed track documentation, we might have something worth reporting to legitimate researchers. Amanda insisted on driving me to the access point, but agreed to wait in the parking area while I made a solo reconnaissance of the hammock. It was a compromise that satisfied neither of us, but represented the best balance between gathering intelligence and maintaining reasonable safety margins. The return journey to the hammock revealed changes that made my blood pressure spike. The cache we'd discovered had been completely cleared out, with no trace remaining of the carefully organized collection of human artifacts. Even more disturbing, the clearing where we'd found it had been systematically cleaned, not just of the cached items, but of any evidence that humans had ever visited the location. I found new tracks, but these had been deliberately obscured. Scratch marks in the soft earth suggested someone or something had used branches to sweep away clear impressions, leaving only vague depressions that could have been made by any number of large animals. But whoever had performed this cleanup operation had missed something crucial. Hidden beneath a fallen palm frond approximately 50 yards from the original cache location, I discovered what appeared to be a deliberate message. A collection of human artifacts, my own military-issue compass, Amanda's field notebook, and a camping utensil from our previous night's dinner, had been arranged in a precise triangle and covered with vegetation. The implications were staggering. Our stalker had not only observed our camp closely enough to identify and collect specific personal items, but had possessed the manual dexterity required to retrieve them without detection, and the intelligence to arrange them in a pattern that would be recognized as artificial rather than accidental. We were dealing with something that understood symbolic communication. I photographed the arrangement from multiple angles, documenting the precise placement of each item and the deliberate nature of their concealment. This was evidence that couldn't be dismissed as misperception or imagination, physical proof that we'd encountered intelligence of a high order. As I prepared to leave the hammock with my documentation, I became aware that I was no longer alone. Not the oppressive feeling of being watched that had characterized our previous encounters, but the definite presence of something nearby that was making no attempt to conceal itself. I looked up to find our observer standing approximately 30 yards away in full daylight. In clear visibility, the creature was even more imposing than it had appeared in darkness. Bipedal and massive, with proportions that suggested enormous physical strength combined with surprising coordination. The face was partially obscured by distance and shadow, but I could see enough to confirm that this was no known primate species. For several minutes we regarded each other with what I can only describe as mutual curiosity. No aggression, no threat displays, just two intelligent beings taking each other's measure across the gap between species. Then, with deliberate slowness, our observer raised one enormous hand in what appeared to be a gesture of acknowledgement, before turning and disappearing into the vegetation with the fluid silence that seemed to be its trademark. I stood frozen for several minutes after it vanished, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The gesture had been unmistakably communicative, a clear indication that our encounter was being conducted according to rules I was only beginning to understand. When I finally returned to the parking area where Amanda waited, she took one look at my face and knew that everything had changed. "You saw it again." I nodded, reviewing the photographs on my camera's display screen. The images of our arranged possessions were clear and unambiguous. Evidence that would be difficult for skeptics to dismiss. "It left us a message," I said, "and I think it's been trying to communicate all along." As we drove away from the Everglades that afternoon, I found myself looking back toward the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere in that primordial landscape, an intelligence beyond our current understanding was continuing its patient observation of the strange new neighbors who had invaded its ancient territory. We'd set out to hunt a cryptid, and instead discovered something far more significant. Sign of evidence that humanity shares this planet with minds we've never bothered to acknowledge or understand. The question now was what we were going to do with that knowledge, and whether we were prepared for the day when our mysterious neighbors decided to make more direct contact with the world beyond the swamp. My name is Coda Nightwolf, and I've been alone in these Alaskan woods for 3 years now. People ask why I took this job stationed at a remote cabin on Shadow Lake, hundreds of miles from the nearest town, checking on hikers and watching for fires in wilderness so vast it swallows sound itself. The truth is, I needed the silence after what happened in Anchorage. I used to be a city cop, working downtown beats where sirens wailed through concrete canyons and gunshots echoed off glass buildings. After 12 years of that chaos, after losing my partner in a convenience store robbery gone wrong, the noise never stopped. Even in my apartment at night, the city hummed and buzzed and scraped against my nerves until I couldn't think straight. When the Park Service posted the opening for Shadow Lake Station, I applied that same day. The helicopter dropped me here on a gray September morning, the pilot shouting over rotor wash about supply runs every 2 weeks and emergency protocols I'd never need. As the aircraft disappeared over the tray line, leaving me with just the whisper of wind through spruce and the gentle lap of water against the dock, I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months. The cabin sits on a small peninsula jutting into Shadow Lake, built from local timber in the 1960s and upgraded with solar panels and satellite communication gear. One room serves as living space, another as office and radio station. A wood stove provides heat, and a generator backup powers the electronics when storms knock out the solar array. The lake stretches 2 miles north to south, surrounded by dense forest that climbs into mountains on 3 sides. The 4th side opens onto the Copper River Valley, a broad expanse of wilderness that extends for hundreds of miles without roads or permanent settlements. My duties seem straightforward: monitor weather and fire conditions, maintain hiking trails around the lake, assist lost or injured visitors during the brief summer season, and file daily reports with headquarters. The closest ranger station was 40 miles south at Beaver Creek, connected by a rough trail that took 8 hours to hike. In winter, when snow blocked the mountains and ice sealed the lake, I would be completely cut off for 4 months. I thought I understood isolation. The first month passed quietly. A few late-season hikers stopped by, grateful for hot coffee and trail information. I updated weather instruments twice daily, recorded lake temperature and water levels, tested the radio equipment. Evenings I read by kerosene lamp and listened to the sounds of the wilderness settling into autumn, the splash of jumping fish, the distant howl of wolves, the crack and groan of trees adjusting to temperature changes. In October, the hikers stopped coming. Migrating birds filled the sky for 2 weeks, then disappeared south, leaving the forest oddly quiet. I began noticing things that hadn't seemed significant before. Scratches on trees, too high and too regular to be natural. Unusual gaps in animal tracks around the cabin, as if creatures were avoiding something. The way my motion sensor lights sometimes triggered in the middle of the night, illuminating empty forest. The first real sign came on Halloween night, though I didn't realize its significance until later. I was splitting firewood behind the cabin when I heard something that made me pause mid-swing. It sounded like knocking 3 deliberate raps, like someone at a door, but the sound came from the forest, maybe 50 yards away. I called out, thinking it might be a late-season hiker, but received no response. When I investigated, I found a dead spruce tree, bark stripped away in long vertical gouges. The wood underneath was fresh and white, still oozing sap. Something had clawed or scraped the tree recently, with enough force to penetrate deep into the trunk. The marks were spaced too wide for bear claws, and no bear I knew could reach 9 feet up a tree trunk. That night, lying in my narrow bunk, I heard the knocking again. 3 raps, closer this time, maybe 20 yards from the cabin. Then silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. I grabbed my flashlight and service weapon, stepped onto the porch and swept the beam across the tree line. Nothing. But the smell hit me then. Musky, organic, like wet fur and rotting meat mixed with something else I couldn't identify. I checked the perimeter in the morning and found them. Footprints in the soft earth near the lakeshore. Each print measured 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth suggested something weighing at least 400 pounds. The stride length was enormous, nearly 6 feet between steps. I photographed the prints, measured them carefully. Included the images in my daily report. The response from headquarters was predictably skeptical. Black bears could leave large prints under certain conditions, they suggested. Might have been a moose track distorted by rain. Had I been drinking? But I knew what I'd seen. And as October gave way to November and snow began falling in the high country, the encounters escalated. The knocking became regular. Every few nights, always after dark, always that same pattern of 3 deliberate raps. Sometimes it came from different directions, as if something were circling the cabin at a distance. Once I heard an answering knock from across the lake, then another from the mountains to the west, like signals being passed between unseen watchers. I installed additional motion sensors around the cabin and began keeping a detailed log of incidents. The sensors triggered frequently but never revealed anything in their range. Tree branches swayed without wind. Rocks shifted positions overnight. My woodpile, neatly stacked against the cabin wall, was repeatedly scattered across the yard in configurations that seemed almost deliberate. The worst incident happened on a November night when the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green fire. I was adjusting the satellite dish on the cabin roof when I heard something massive crashing through the forest. Trees snapped and bushes thrashed, as whatever it was approached the lake from the north. I climbed down quickly, grabbed my rifle, and positioned myself in the doorway. The sound stopped at the forest edge, maybe 60 feet away. For several minutes, nothing moved except the dancing lights overhead. Then I saw it, a shape among the trees, darker than shadow, tall enough that its head was visible above the brush line. It stood motionless, and though I couldn't make out features, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical presence. I raised my rifle, centered the scope on the shape, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold steady aim. The thing seemed to sense my intention. It turned, moving with fluid grace despite its size, and melted back into the forest without a sound. When morning came, I found where it had stood. The ground was compressed in a rough circle 8 feet across. Broken branches hung at head height 12 feet above the earth, and pressed deep into the frozen soil were those same enormous footprints, so clear I could see the texture of skin in the toe impressions. I knew then that I was sharing these woods with something that shouldn't exist. Something ancient and intelligent. Something that understood it was being watched and measured and recorded. As I radioed my daily report that morning, choosing my words carefully to avoid sounding unstable, I wondered if I was the first ranger at Shadow Lake to encounter this presence, or simply the first foolish enough to document it. The radio crackled with static as I signed off. Somewhere in the forest behind me, 3 deliberate knocks echoed through the trees. Winter arrived early that year. sealing Shadow Lake under 2 feet of ice by Thanksgiving. The isolation became absolute. No supply drops, no radio contact except for daily check-ins. No chance of evacuation until spring breakup. Just me, the cabin, and whatever lurked in the surrounding wilderness. I established routines to maintain sanity. Equipment checks every morning. Weather readings at noon and 6 p.m. Physical exercise to stay sharp. But as December shortened the days to barely 4 hours of gray light, those routines felt increasingly meaningless against the growing certainty that I was being systematically hunted. The pattern became clear over those dark weeks. My visitor, I'd started thinking of it as the Watcher, appeared most often during storms, using wind and snow to mask its movements. I would hear those distinctive knocks during blizzards, sometimes from multiple directions simultaneously, as if a whole group were coordinating their approach. The motion sensors continued their erratic triggering, but now I sometimes glimpsed massive shapes moving just beyond their range. On December 15th, the routine was shattered by an emergency transmission. A family of 4 had missed their check-in at Beaver Creek Station after attempting to cross the Copper River Valley on snowmobiles. Their planned route would take them within 10 miles of Shadow Lake. I was asked to monitor for signals, watch for smoke, and assist if they appeared in my area. The Hendricks family, Jim and Susan, with teenage children Mike and Jessica, had been missing for 36 hours when I picked up their distress beacon. The signal was weak and intermittent, suggesting damaged equipment, but the bearing put them northwest of my position, somewhere in the maze of valleys below Sentinel Peak. I prepared for a rescue mission with mixed feelings. My duty was clear, but venturing into the wilderness while being stalked by something unknown felt like walking into a carefully prepared trap. Still, 4 lives were at stake. I loaded my pack with survival gear, emergency medical supplies, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. The snowshoe trek toward their beacon took me through terrain I'd never explored. Steep ravines choked with fallen timber, boulder fields hidden under deceptive snow, and dense thickets where shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. The temperature held steady at -15, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. I found their camp in a sheltered valley 3 hours from the cabin. 2 snowmobiles sat abandoned near a hastily constructed shelter built from pine branches and a torn tarp. Blood stained the snow around the camp. Not much, but enough to suggest injury. Their equipment was scattered as if they'd left in tremendous hurry. Inside the shelter, I found Jim Hendricks's journal, pages ripped and partially scattered. The final legible entry was dated 2 days earlier. Something followed us from the river crossing. Mike swears he saw it yesterday. Tall as a tree, watching from the ridgeline. Susan thinks it's just the stress. But I've heard the calls at night. Not wolves. Not anything I recognize. Decided to push for Shadow Lake tomorrow. Hope the ranger there can radio for extraction. The journal ended mid-sentence, as if he'd been interrupted while writing. I followed their trail from the abandoned camp. The family's snowshoe tracks headed southeast toward Shadow Lake, but they were accompanied by those other prints, the ones I knew so well. The Watcher had indeed followed them, sometimes walking parallel to their route, sometimes crossing directly over their path. In several places I could see where the family had stopped, huddled together, probably listening to sounds in the forest around them. The trail ended at Deadfall Creek, where rushing water kept the surface from freezing solid. Boot prints showed the family had tried to cross on a fallen log, but something had gone wrong. I found torn fabric caught on branches downstream, dark stains on the rocks that might have been blood. On the far side of the creek, only 3 sets of human tracks continued toward Shadow Lake. Someone hadn't made the crossing. I radioed headquarters with my preliminary findings, requesting immediate search and rescue backup. The response was frustrating but predictable. Weather conditions prohibited helicopter flights. The nearest ground team was at least 2 days away, and I was authorized to continue searching, but advised to return to the cabin before nightfall. Following the remaining trail, I noticed changes in the family's movement pattern. Where their earlier tracks had shown steady, purposeful travel, now they were erratic. They'd stopped frequently, sometimes backtracking, sometimes breaking into runs that left deep, desperate impressions in the snow. And those other prints were everywhere, circling, converging, herding. I found Mike Hendricks in a shallow cave 5 miles from Deadfall Creek. The 17-year-old was hypothermic and incoherent, wrapped in an emergency blanket with his left arm bound in a crude splint. He'd been there at least 12 hours, maybe longer. Getting him conscious took precious time and most of my hot water. When he could finally speak, the words came in broken whispers. It took Jessica first at the creek. She fell, hurt her leg. That thing came out of nowhere. 8 feet tall, covered in hair like a bear but walking upright. Dad tried to fight it off with an axe, but it just grabbed her and disappeared into the trees. We could hear her screaming for maybe 5 minutes, then nothing. Mike's story became more fragmented as I worked to stabilize his injuries. The family had fled through the night, pursued by sounds in the darkness around them. His mother had collapsed from exhaustion somewhere near Owl Ridge. His father had stayed with her, sent Mike ahead to find help, but that was hours ago, and he'd lost the trail in a whiteout. I made the hardest decision of my career, leaving Mike in the cave with most of my supplies while I tried to locate his parents. He was stable enough to survive until morning, but Jim and Susan Hendricks were somewhere in this wilderness with an injured leg and no shelter. They wouldn't last another night in these temperatures. The search took me deeper into the mountains than I'd ever ventured. The wind had erased most tracks, but I followed logical routes someone in their situation might take. Game trails, stream beds, any path that offered easier travel. As darkness fell, I used my headlamp sparingly, preserving battery life while relying on moonlight reflected off snow. I found them in a clearing below Owl Ridge, huddled together against a massive pine tree. Susan Hendricks was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. Jim was conscious but barely responsive, his movements sluggish with advanced hypothermia. Both showed signs of severe frostbite on fingers and toes. As I worked to stabilize them with my remaining supplies, Jim grabbed my arm with surprising strength. His eyes were wild, pupils dilated with shock and exposure. "It's still out there," he whispered. "Been following us all day. Staying just out of sight, but I can smell it, waiting for us to get weaker." I listened carefully, but heard only wind through the trees. Yet something felt wrong about the clearing. Too quiet, too still, as if the normal night sounds had been frightened into silence. Building a fire seemed like the only option to keep the Hendricks alive until morning. Despite the risk of attracting unwanted attention, I cleared a spot in the snow, gathered dry wood from dead branches, and soon had flames crackling against the darkness. The orange light pushed back shadows but also made us visible for miles. That's when I heard them, those familiar 3 knocks echoing from the ridgeline above us. They were answered from the valley below, then from somewhere to our left. We were surrounded. Jim Hendricks heard them too. He struggled to sit up despite his condition, staring at the dark forest around our small circle of firelight. "Jesus," he breathed. "There's more than one." The sounds began moving, deliberate footsteps crunching through snow, circling our position at a distance. Sometimes I caught glimpses of shapes between the trees, tall figures that seemed to flow rather than walk. The smell reached us then, that same musky organic odor I'd encountered at the cabin, but stronger now, mixed with something that reminded me of carrion. I kept my rifle ready while tending the fire, adding wood to maintain the flames that seemed to be our only protection. Whatever was out there appeared content to wait, maintaining their circle while making just enough noise to ensure we knew they were present. Susan Hendricks regained consciousness briefly around midnight. Her first words were about Jessica. "Did you find her? Is she safe?" I couldn't answer honestly. The likelihood of a 17-year-old girl surviving even a few hours in the custody of whatever had taken her was essentially zero. But hope might be all that kept this mother fighting hypothermia. "We'll find her," I lied. "Focus on staying warm." Dawn seemed impossibly far away. The temperature dropped steadily, and my wood supply was running low. Each time I ventured beyond the firelight to gather more fuel, I felt eyes watching from the darkness. Once, when reaching for a fallen branch, I saw a massive footprint in fresh snow just outside the circle of illumination, so close that whatever left it had been standing mere feet away while I worked. The worst moment came around 3 a.m., when Susan began seizing from hypothermia. As I struggled to control her convulsions, the sounds from the forest changed. The deliberate footsteps became more aggressive, branches snapped closer to our position, and the smell grew overwhelming. Something was working up the courage to approach. I fired 3 shots into the air, the universal distress signal, hoping the noise might drive them back. The sound stopped immediately, but I could feel the attention focused on us like a physical weight. They were still there, still watching, just more cautious now. When gray light finally crept over the mountains, I found tracks everywhere around our camp, dozens of enormous footprints, some so fresh they couldn't be more than minutes old. The creatures had approached within yards of our fire during the night, close enough to observe every detail of our desperate vigil. But with daylight, they had withdrawn. The helicopter arrived at noon, its rotor wash scattering ash from our dying fire across the clearing. As the medical team worked to stabilize Jim and Susan Hendricks, I briefed the search coordinator on what we'd found and carefully omitted what we'd encountered. Mike Hendricks was evacuated from his cave, suffering severe frostbite but alive. His parents were airlifted to Fairbanks General in critical condition. I volunteered to continue searching for Jessica, though everyone understood the grim mathematics of survival in sub-zero wilderness. The search team spent 3 days combing the area around Deadfall Creek. We found torn pieces of Jessica's jacket caught in trees nearly a mile from where she'd disappeared. Fragments of evidence that suggested she'd been carried rather than walking. The trail led into a maze of canyons and rock formations too dangerous to explore fully, especially with another storm system approaching from the west. On the final day of the official search, I found something the others had missed. Hidden in a grove of ancient pines was a structure unlike anything in my ranger training. A crude shelter built from interwoven branches, large enough to house something enormous. The ground around it was packed smooth from repeated use, and the smell was so intense I had to breathe through my mouth to avoid retching. Inside the shelter, partially buried under pine needles and debris, I found human remains. Not Jessica. These bones were much older, weathered by seasons of exposure. Along with the bones were artifacts that made my blood run cold: a wedding ring, a child's toy, fragments of clothing from different eras. This thing had been hunting people in these mountains for decades. I documented everything with photographs but kept my discovery from the search team. Without Jessica's body, there was nothing more we could do officially. The search was called off. The area marked as a probable fatality, and life moved forward with the ruthless efficiency that bureaucracy applies to unsolvable problems. But I couldn't let it rest. After the helicopters departed and I returned to Shadow Lake Station, I began preparing for what I knew was inevitable. The Watcher had allowed me to interfere with its hunt, had let me rescue 3 members of its chosen prey, but that intervention would require a response. It knew where I lived, knew my routines, had been studying me for months. The game had changed, and winter still had 2 months to run. I reinforced the cabin as best I could, boarding up windows, creating clear fields of fire, stockpiling ammunition and supplies. The radio remained my lifeline to the outside world, but I knew no help would come until spring. Whatever happened in these woods would be settled between predator and prey, just as it had been for thousands of years before rangers and radios and rescue helicopters. The first direct attack came on New Year's Eve, during a blizzard that dropped 4 inches of snow per hour and reduced visibility to arm's length. I was monitoring weather instruments when something struck the cabin wall with tremendous force, hard enough to shake the entire structure. Then another impact, and another, as if multiple attackers were coordinating their assault. I grabbed my rifle and extinguished all lights, relying on night vision to peer through cracks in the boarded windows. Shapes moved through the storm, at least 3 large figures circling the cabin, occasionally rushing forward to strike the walls or test the reinforced door. The wood groaned under their assault, but held. The attack lasted 6 hours. They tried everything, prying at the boarded windows, climbing onto the roof to claw at the metal chimney, even attempting to dig under the foundation. But the cabin had been built to withstand decades of Alaskan weather, and my reinforcements held against their assault. When dawn broke and the storm cleared, I found evidence of the siege everywhere. Claw marks gouged deep into the cabin walls, chunks of sod torn from the roof, and in the fresh snow, a complex pattern of enormous footprints showing how they'd coordinated their attack, approaching from multiple directions with tactical precision that spoke of intelligence far beyond animal instinct. More disturbing were the trophies they'd left behind, scattered around the cabin like calling cards. A hiker's boot, old and weathered. A piece of tent fabric. Most chilling of all, a child's mitten, small and bright red, partially buried near my woodpile. I radioed headquarters with a carefully worded report about storm damage to the cabin, requesting emergency evacuation due to structural concerns. The response was predictably unsympathetic. Weather conditions prohibited flights, emergency services were overextended due to the recent search operation, and I was reminded that accepting this posting meant accepting the associated risks. I was on my own until spring breakup, at least 6 weeks away. The psychological warfare began immediately. Every night brought new harassments. Sounds of something large moving around the cabin, scratching at the walls, testing doors and windows for weakness. My motion sensors triggered constantly, but the attackers had learned to stay just beyond the range of their lights. Most unsettling were the calls, vocalizations unlike anything in my experience with North American wildlife. Deep resonant sounds that seemed to carry meaning, as if different individuals were communicating with each other. Sometimes they came from directly outside the cabin, so close I could feel the vibrations through the walls. Other times they echoed from miles away, passing messages across vast distances of wilderness. I began losing weight from stress and broken sleep. My daily reports became increasingly cryptic as I struggled to document what was happening without sounding completely insane. The isolation was becoming a weapon they wielded expertly, knowing that fear and exhaustion would eventually weaken my defenses. The breakthrough came in February, during a brief warm spell that softened the snow enough for detailed tracking. Following fresh prints from the previous night's harassment, I discovered something that changed my understanding of what I was facing. Hidden in a cluster of boulders half a mile from the cabin was a cache. Not just food storage, but a deliberate collection of objects taken from human victims over many years. Backpacks arranged by size and color, camping gear sorted by function, personal items organized with the methodical care of a museum curator. Among the artifacts was a Park Service radio, its battery long dead but its call sign still visible. Shadow Lake Station. My predecessor, the ranger who'd held this posting before me, had supposedly transferred to a station in Colorado, but here was his equipment, carefully preserved in this macabre collection. I found his journal buried beneath newer acquisitions, its final entries documenting encounters identical to my own. The last legible page was dated 3 years earlier, just before the spring breakup that should have brought his rotation out of these mountains. They've been patient, but winter is ending, and I think they know I'll be leaving soon. The harassment has stopped completely. No sounds, no movement, nothing for 5 days now. It feels wrong, like they're waiting for something. Maybe I'm finally going crazy from the isolation, but I keep thinking they want me to make the first move. The journal ended there. Whatever had happened to Ranger Peterson during his final days at Shadow Lake Station was now happening to me. Understanding their patience changed everything. They weren't trying to drive me away or break into the cabin. They were waiting for me to venture out, to make myself vulnerable during the inevitable supply run or equipment repair that would force me into the open. The siege was just preparation, psychological conditioning to ensure I was properly afraid when the moment came. But knowing their strategy gave me an advantage they couldn't anticipate. Instead of waiting passively for spring extraction, I began planning an offensive. If the Watcher and its companions wanted a hunt, I would give them one, but not the kind they expected. I spent 2 weeks preparing, using techniques learned in military training that predated my police career. I created caches of supplies and ammunition at strategic points around the lake, prepared escape routes and fallback positions, studied their movement patterns during nightly observations. Most importantly, I identified their weakness for all their intelligence and coordination. They were creatures of habit, following the same approaches and retreat paths night after night. The final confrontation came on a clear, cold night in late February. Aurora Borealis painted the sky in curtains of green and gold, providing just enough light for what I had planned. I left the cabin openly, carrying a heavy pack and following the trail toward Beaver Creek Station, as if attempting the overland journey to my nearest neighbor. They followed, of course. I could hear them moving through the forest parallels to the trail, keeping pace but staying hidden. The sounds of their movement became bolder as I traveled farther from the cabin's protection, as if they sensed the culmination of their long hunt approaching. When I reached the predetermined ambush point, a narrow valley where the trail crossed open ground between steep ridges, I activated my plan. Emergency flares, scattered and hidden during previous reconnaissance, suddenly blazed to life on both sides of the valley. The creatures were caught in brilliant red illumination, their positions revealed for the first time. There were 5 of them, massive bipedal figures covered in dark hair, moving with fluid grace despite their size. The largest stood nearly 9 feet tall, its shoulders broad enough to span a doorway. They froze in the sudden light, dark eyes reflecting the flare's crimson glow like mirrors. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they overcame their surprise and either fled or attacked. Using a hunting rifle equipped with a scope and loaded with high-velocity rounds designed for large game, I took careful aim at the largest figure. The shot echoed through the valley like thunder. The creature staggered, dark blood visible against its hair, but it didn't fall. Instead, it turned toward me with an expression of rage and intelligence that no animal should possess. The others began moving immediately, spreading out to flank my position with tactical precision. What followed was the most terrifying 15 minutes of my life. Using pre-positioned supplies and prepared firing positions, I fought a running battle against creatures that combined animal strength with human-level intelligence. They adapted quickly to my tactics, using cover effectively, coordinating their movements, even attempting to drive me toward positions where their superior reach and strength would be decisive. I wounded at least 2 more before my ammunition ran low and retreat became necessary. Following escape routes I'd scouted previously, I made my way back to the cabin through forests that had become a battleground. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded, but I knew this was temporary. I'd escalated beyond their patience, beyond their careful psychological games. They would come for me directly now. I spent the next 3 days and nights in a state of siege warfare, moving constantly between prepared positions around the cabin, never staying in one place long enough for them to coordinate an assault. They tried several approaches: direct attacks on the cabin's defenses, attempts to drive me into the open with fire and noise, even what appeared to be a crude attempt to divert the stream that supplied my water. But something had changed in the dynamic. Whether from the wounds I'd inflicted or simple recognition that I was more dangerous than previous prey, they began showing increased caution. The attacks became less frequent, more probing than committed. Several times I caught glimpses of them withdrawing when they thought I was well positioned to defend myself. On the 4th morning, the forest fell completely silent. I waited through the day for renewed assault, but it never came. When night fell with no sounds of movement in the surrounding wilderness, I began to understand. They had withdrawn, not in defeat, but in recognition that the cost of continuing this hunt had grown too high. The spring breakup came early that year, ice cracking with sounds like gunshots as Shadow Lake began its seasonal thaw. When the supply helicopter finally arrived in March, I was packed and ready to leave. I filed my resignation that day, citing personal reasons that couldn't be discussed in official reports. The Park Service accepted my decision with the bureaucratic indifference typical of government agencies losing an experienced employee. Shadow Lake Station would be transferred to a new ranger that summer, someone fresh and eager to experience the pristine wilderness of interior Alaska. I never told them about Ranger Peterson. I never mentioned the cache of human artifacts hidden in the boulder field. I never explained the real reason that Shadow Lake Station had such difficulty maintaining permanent staff. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, some truths too terrible to document in official files. The creatures that hunt in those mountains have been there longer than human memory, and they'll be there long after rangers and radio towers and rescue helicopters have been forgotten. I live in Arizona now, working security for a mining company, surrounded by desert and open sky. But sometimes, on clear nights when the wind carries unfamiliar scents, I hear echoes of those 3 deliberate knocks and wonder if the next ranger at Shadow Lake Station is learning what I learned in those dark woods. Some hunts never really end. They just find new prey. The dispatch crackled through the static like bones snapping in a fire, then died as the figure dragged a half-ton steer across County Road 12 and stared straight through my windshield. Its joints bent wrong, eyes like burn holes in parchment. I slammed the brakes too late and felt the cruiser rise suddenly, weightless for a heartbeat before crashing back to earth. I'm Riley Hartman, and what I'm about to tell you took place in 2011 in Escalante, Utah. The desert here doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't forget them either. The day started slow, the way most days do before they turn into nightmares. I signed out a beat-up Crown Vic at 6 a.m., the keys still warm from the night shift deputy's sweaty palm. The coffee tasted of tin and regret, bitter enough to strip paint. I drove the red dirt loop past the grazing leases north of town, where the Mormon settlers had tried to make something green grow in all that emptiness. The morning sun painted the messes the color of dried blood, and the wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that made my skin crawl without knowing why. A ranch hand waved me down before I even finished the cup. His face was the color of sour milk, and his hands shook as he pointed toward the grazing land. "You need to see this, officer. Need to see it right now." 2 Angus yearlings lay 40 yards apart. Their spines snapped clean, ribs peeled open as if something had pried them with tire irons. The precision was what got to me first. No ragged tears, no claw marks, just surgical separation of flesh from bone. The morning flies hadn't even found them yet, as if they knew to stay away. No truck tracks scarred the hardpan. No coyote prints circled the carcasses. No sign of a fight. No drag marks leading away from the kill site. The cattle lay exactly where they'd fallen, their eyes wide and clouded, tongues swollen black between their teeth. But it was the emptiness that made my breakfast crawl up my throat. The hollow cavities where their organs should have been, cleaned out so thoroughly that the inner walls gleamed like polished marble. I marked the scene with orange cones, called it in, and waited for Deputy Addy Perez. The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. Even the meadowlarks had gone quiet, and in 20 years of working these counties, I'd never heard the desert hold its breath like that. Addie showed up 40 minutes later, chewing sunflower seeds and spitting the shells through her open window. She popped the hood on one calf, frowned at the emptiness inside like she was looking under the hood of a stripped car. "Whatever did this hauled them out like oysters," she said, her voice carrying too far in the thin air, clean as a whistle. I told her to keep her voice down. The rancher, a tough Mormon named Clegg, looked ready to cry. His face had gone gray as cement, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling.
40 years I've worked this land," he whispered. "Never seen anything like it. Never even heard stories."
We walked the fence line, boots crunching on gravel that sounded like breaking glass. The barbed wire sagged like cut ribbon where something had passed through, the metal twisted into impossible spirals. On the far side, fresh drag marks led toward the slot canyons, grooves an inch deep, straight as survey stakes, too tidy for any scavenger I knew. The tracks were wrong from the start. They reminded me of a child's drawing of a hand, only backward, with the thumb missing. Long, narrow impressions spaced less than a foot apart, each ending in 4 blunt points. But it was the spacing that made my scalp tighten. Precisely 32 inches between each print, measured to the millimeter. No variation, no hesitation, as if the thing moved like a machine. We followed the trail into the maze of sandstone corridors where the rock walls pressed close enough to touch both sides with outstretched arms. The desert kept silent except for our boots echoing off the stone. And the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like voices whispering in an empty church. Between sage clumps we found more prints. Addie photographed them, but the images looked fake even on the camera screen. Too precise, too deliberate, as if someone had carved them with tools. The desert dust should have softened the edges, but these marks looked fresh as surgery scars. By noon, we'd hiked 3 miles into the slots. Sunlight thinned to a hard blue strip above us, and the air smelled of wet stone, though the soil was dust dry. The walls rose higher with each step, closing overhead like a stone coffin. Radio contact faded first to static, then to nothing. Addie tapped her handset, shrugged, and mouthed, "Keep close." I kept my sidearm drawn, though I couldn't say what I expected to shoot. The marks on the ground never wavered, never crossed each other, as if the thing glided without weight. They led us deeper into the labyrinth, past pictographs left by people who'd fled this place centuries ago, their painted figures running from something with too many arms. Then the tracks just stopped on a smooth sandstone shelf. No blood, no calves, no exit prints, only a shallow depression the size of a bathtub, polished like glass. The stone around it had been worn smooth, as if something had rested there for a very long time. Addie crouched to study it, her camera clicking in the silence. "Riley," she whispered, "look at this." The depression wasn't empty. Carved into the stone were symbols, not pictographs, but something older, something that hurt to look at directly. They spiraled inward toward the center, where a single hole disappeared into darkness. The air rising from it carried the scent of copper and meat gone bad. That's when we heard it. The hiss wasn't a roar, wasn't even loud, just a sound like air escaping from a punctured lung. but it poured out of the darkness behind us with the weight of centuries. The stone walls caught it and threw it back, multiplying the whisper until it surrounded us like a living thing. I swung around, saw nothing but shadows dancing in the Slot Canyon's depths. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, thick and expectant like the pause before a scream. When I turned back, Addie was gone. The grip of her camera still hung in midair for a blink, suspended like a magic trick, then clattered on the rock. The sound echoed off the walls sharp as gunshots. I called her name until my throat hurt, but the canyon answered with metallic echoes that sounded like other people pretending to be me. Addie. My voice cracked on the second syllable. Addie, where are you? The silence stretched like a held breath. Then from somewhere deep in the maze I heard her voice. Riley? Riley, help me. But it wasn't quite right. The words came too slowly, with spaces between them like someone reading from a script. And underneath that same wet hiss, as if something was learning to speak with a mouth full of blood. I backed up the way we'd come, tracing my own footprints in the dust. The walls seemed to lean inward, pressing closer with each step. The strip of sky above narrowed to a thread of blue, and the shadows grew teeth. Riley, I'm hurt. I can't move. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the stone like a ball in a box. It was Addie's voice, but wrong, too high, too breathless, like air being forced through a broken reed. Each word seemed to take enormous effort. I drew my weapon, though my hands shook so badly I could barely hold it. The Slot Canyon branched ahead. Left led deeper into the maze, right curved back toward the surface. The voice came from the left, pleading now. Don't leave me here, please. It's so dark. Something glittered in the sand at my feet. Addie's badge. The metal twisted into a spiral that made my eyes water to follow. Beside it, a dark stain soaked into the dust, too black to be blood, too thick to be water. 5 minutes later, I was running. The canyon walls blurred past, and my breath came in sharp gasps that echoed like sobs. Every shadow looked like reaching arms, every wind sound like that terrible hiss. Behind me, the voice kept calling, but it was changing, becoming something else, something that had learned her words but not her fear. 20 minutes after that, I cleared the slots and found my cruiser baking in the sun. I poured water over my head until I could breathe again, but the taste of copper wouldn't leave my mouth. My radio squawked with static, and for a moment I thought I heard Addie's voice underneath the noise, still calling my name. Back at the station, the chief told me we'd lost enough men in those rocks to old mine shafts and sudden floods. We wait for daylight, he said, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. I reminded him it was still daylight. The sun blazed overhead, brutal and white, but something in the air made it feel like dusk. He rubbed the badge on his chest like a worry stone and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The station felt different, too quiet, too still. The fluorescent lights flickered with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat, and the coffee in the break room had gone cold, though I'd made it fresh an hour ago. Through the window I could see the Slot Canyons in the distance, their shadows darker than they should be. I tried to write up a report, but the words wouldn't come. How do you describe the sound of someone being erased? How do you explain the weight of absence? The shape of a person-sized hole in the world? The phone rang. I picked it up, hoping for news, for anything that made sense. Riley? The voice was soft, familiar. I'm still here. I'm still waiting. I slammed the phone down, but it kept ringing. Each ring sounded like a scream. I borrowed the department's infrared scope and a .308 rifle from the armory they kept for mountain lions. The weapon felt solid in my hands, real in a way nothing else had since the canyon. I signed the log with shaking fingers and took the cruiser out again, driving toward something I couldn't name but knew was waiting. Dusk bled into the gulches like spilled wine, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. The desert never held heat after sundown, but tonight felt different. Colder, hungrier, as if the darkness was feeding on the warmth. On the ridge above Clegg's ranch, turkey vultures circled but refused to land. They rode the thermals in tight spirals, their shadows wheeling across the ground like clock hands, but they wouldn't descend, wouldn't take what the desert offered. Even they knew something was wrong. The cattle huddled in the far corner of the main pen, their eyes rolling white in the gathering darkness. They pressed against the fence until the wire sang with tension, and the sound of their breathing came in sharp, panicked bursts. Whatever had visited them before, they remembered. At 2013 hours, the stockyard lights snapped off. Not dimmed, not flickered. They died all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. My dashboard lights followed, gauges fading to black. The radio gave a burst of static and went silent. I coasted to a stop, engine quiet, and heard metal banging inside the main pen. The sound came in steady intervals, like a heartbeat, like breathing. Using the rifle's optic like a camera, I scanned the yard. The cattle crowded the far fence. Their bodies pressed so tight together they looked like a single, many-legged creature. Their eyes caught the starlight and threw it back in points of fire. Near the feed bins where the shadows were deepest, something moved. It stood taller than the gatepost, hairless, the color of butcher paper left too long in the sun. Its skin stretched over cables of muscle that twitched in steady ripples, like water disturbed by wind. The thing had no head, no eyes, just a torso that divided at the sternum into two equal halves that opened and closed like saloon doors. Behind the opening, I glimpsed raw meat and a curtain of cartilage that moved like seaweed in a current. The sound it made was wet and rhythmic, like a great lung breathing through water. As I watched, it lifted a heifer by the hips, a 1,000-pound animal raised like a child's toy, and folded it into itself without bending its own limbs. The cow disappeared into that terrible opening with barely a sound, just a soft, wet sigh. The thing's chest snapped shut like a trap, and for a moment it stood perfectly still, digesting. Then it turned toward my hiding place with that same precise 32-inch stride. I fired. The round slapped flesh with a sound like a hammer hitting meat. A bloom of dark spray hit the dirt, but the thing didn't drop. It paused, swaying slightly, then continued its approach. The wound pinched shut, leaving only powdery residue around the hole, as if it were made of clay that could reshape itself. I retreated to the grain silo, my boots ringing on the metal ladder. The bent sheet metal door slammed behind me, and I barricaded it with a pallet, though I knew it wouldn't hold. Inside the domed roof, the smell of mildew and rotting corn felt thick enough to chew. I lay flat on the catwalk, rifle barrel through a rust hole, and waited. The silence stretched like a held breath. Then the tin buckled below, and a pale arm jointed wrong, bending in too many places, probed through the door gap. The fingers were wrong, too. Paddle wide, boneless pads ringed with short claws more suited to scooping than grabbing. They moved with deliberate intelligence, testing the air, learning the space. Another arm followed, then another, until the door creased outward like tin foil. The hinges shrieked as the shape slid inside, rising until its back brushed the silo roof. In the dim light, I could see it clearly for the first time. The open torso tilted toward me, ribs flexing like fingers, and I understood that this wasn't a mouth, it was something else, something worse. It moved by rocking its hips, tipping like a crane. Its body always balanced despite its impossible height. No mouth sounds, no breathing, just the wet whisper of its chest opening and closing. The smell that rose from it was copper and meat, and something else, something that made my hindbrain scream. I remembered the methane tap feeding the grain dryer, illegal but ancient. Clegg had never upgraded, and the line ran right through the silo floor. I crab-crawled to the ladder hatch, dropped 2 rungs, and reached the valve with my boot. Steel groaned as I turned it. Gas hissed into the enclosed space, rising high and mean. The shape reacted, swaying, its chest slamming shut for the first time. The sound reminded me of a giant envelope being sealed, final and absolute. I sparked a road flare and tossed it onto the floor. The gas caught with a thud, and a flash of white heat that seared my eyebrows. The explosion blew upward, punched me through the hatch, and threw the shape against the far wall where it writhed in flames without giving voice. I hit the ground outside, rolled toward the irrigation ditch, and plunged headfirst into water so cold it stopped my heart for a beat. Behind me, the silo ejected a column of smoke and shrapnel that rained down like burning snow. When I crawled out, the yard lights flickered back on. The silo's roof lay twisted 10 yards away, and embers drifted through the air like fireflies. I circled with the rifle raised, but found no trace of the thing. Only a long smear of grayish ash leading to the tree line, as if something had dragged a sack of cement toward the hills. The cattle had gone quiet. They stood in the far corner of the pen, no longer panicked but not calm either. They watched the tree line with the patience of prey, that knows the predator is only sleeping. The explosion's echo rolled across the desert like thunder, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my eardrums with the weight of judgment, and somewhere in that quiet I heard the sound of something moving through the trees. Not footsteps, something else, something that didn't need feet to travel. I kept the rifle trained on the ash smear, my finger tight on the trigger. The gray residue glittered in the yard lights like ground glass, and as I watched it began to move, not scattered by wind, but flowing, gathering itself into streams that crept toward the fence line. The cattle saw it too. They pressed back against the far corner of the pen, their bodies shuddering with each breath. One of them, a young bull with a white patch on his forehead, let out a sound I'd never heard before. Not a bellow, not a moo, but something closer to a human scream. The ash streams reached the fence and began to climb. They flowed up the posts like liquid mercury, defying gravity, seeking something. Where they touched the barbed wire, the metal began to change. The steel grew soft, malleable, twisting into spirals that hurt to look at directly. I backed toward the irrigation ditch, but the water had gone black. Not dark black, like ink or blood, or something worse. The surface didn't reflect the yard lights anymore, just swallowed them whole. As I watched, bubbles rose from the depths, each one carrying a whisper. Riley. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Riley, help me. It was Addie's voice, but wrong. Too wet, too hollow, like someone speaking through a mouthful of liquid. The words came with the smell of copper and decay, and underneath that same wet hiss I'd heard in the canyon. I'm cold, Riley. I'm so cold. The ash had finished climbing the fence and was spreading across the ground like a living thing. Where it touched the earth, the grass withered and turned gray. The cattle were silent now, their eyes wide with an intelligence that didn't belong in animal faces. I ran toward the road, boots pounding on hardpan, but the cruiser was gone. In its place stood a figure that might have been human once, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down past its knees. It turned toward me with emotion like a flower following the sun. The face was the worst part. It had Addie's features, but they were stretched like taffy, pulled into shapes that belonged in a funhouse mirror. The eyes were too wide, too bright, and they held no recognition, only hunger. Found you, it said, and the voice was definitely hers now, but coming from the wrong throat. Been looking so long. I raised the rifle, sighted on the center of its chest, and pulled the trigger. The round passed through it like smoke, and the thing laughed with Addie's voice. The sound echoed off the rocks, multiplying until it surrounded me like a chorus of ghosts. Behind the figure, more shapes emerged from the darkness. They moved with that same 32-inch stride, but they weren't all the same. Some were tall and pale like the first, others squat and dark. One crawled on too many arms, its face a mass of moving parts that might have been eyes or mouths or something else entirely. But they all had one thing in common. They were wearing pieces of people I'd known. A deputy's badge here, a rancher's hat there, a woman's earrings dangling from flesh that had never been human. They were collectors, I realized, gatherers of identity, wearing their victims like clothes. The one with Addie's face reached out with fingers that stretched like rubber bands. They wrapped around my wrist, and where they touched, my skin began to burn. Not with heat, but with cold so intense it felt like fire. Come with us, it said. Come home. I jerked away, leaving skin behind, and stumbled toward the grain silo. The metal was still hot from the explosion, but it felt real in a way nothing else did. I pressed my back against it and raised the rifle again, though I knew it wouldn't help. The shapes circled me like wolves, their movements perfectly synchronized. They didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't make any sound except for the wet whisper of their passage. One of them, the one that had been in the silo, had reformed itself, its pale flesh smooth and unmarked by the flames. You can't kill us, it said, speaking with the voice of someone I'd never heard before. We're already dead. Have been for a long time. The circle tightened. I could smell them now. Copper and meat and something else. Something that made my stomach turn. The smell of things that should have been buried, should have been forgotten, but kept walking anyway. That's when I remembered the flare. Still clutched in my left hand. Its chemical glow guttering but not dead. I cracked it against the silo wall, and red light flared between us. The shapes recoiled, their forms wavering like smoke. "Light," one of them hissed. "It burns." I held the flare high, and they backed away. Not far, just enough to give me breathing room. But I could see others gathering at the edge of the red glow, more than I could count, their eyes reflecting the light like mirrors. "What do you want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The one with Addie's face smiled, and I saw that its teeth were too sharp, too many. "To go home," it said. "To take everyone home." "Where's home?" It pointed toward the slot canyons, toward the darkness between the rocks where no light had ever reached. "Down there. Down where it's quiet. Down where nothing changes." The flare was dying. I could feel the heat fading, see the red glow dimming. When it went out, they would come for me, and I would become another collector, another shape in their terrible parade. But then I heard something else. The sound of engines, of vehicles racing across the desert. Headlights swept across the yard, and the shapes scattered like roaches, flowing back toward the trees and the darkness beyond. The cavalry had arrived, but I wasn't sure they were ready for what they'd find. At dawn, state troopers combed the site like archaeologists, their cameras flashing in the gray light. They found Addie's radio first, then her badge, fused to a strip of pink tissue near the smashed feed bin. The tissue carried human DNA markers, but no match in any database, as if it belonged to someone who had never existed. The tissue was wrong in other ways too. Under the microscope, it showed cellular structures that bent light in impossible directions. Crystals of something that shouldn't exist in living matter. The lab techs whispered about it in the corners, their voices tight with fear they couldn't name. The prints in the canyon had turned brittle overnight and crumbled under the first boot that touched them. What had been clear tracks the day before became nothing more than disturbed dust, as if the desert itself was erasing the evidence. They questioned me for 7 hours in a room that smelled of stale coffee and fear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and every shadow looked like reaching arms. I gave them my notes, my photos, my rounds counted and recounted. The digital files showed nothing but static, and the photographs were blank except for one, a single image of something pale standing in the background of a crime scene photo, something that hadn't been there when I took the picture. They thanked me, typed it up as an animal attack, and shipped the report to a locker none of us will ever open. The official story was predators, maybe a pack of feral dogs. The missing deputy was listed as a hiking accident, presumed fallen into one of the many chasms that honeycomb the desert. But I knew better. I'd seen the way the other officers looked at me, the way they stepped aside when I walked down the hall. They'd read my report, seen the photos, and they knew that something had come out of the deep places of the earth to hunt. Addie's status changed from missing to deceased presumed. Her funeral was held on a Tuesday, and I was the only one who came. The casket was empty, of course. There wasn't enough left to bury. But I stood there anyway, in the heat and the silence, and tried to remember her as she'd been before the canyon took her. The preacher spoke about souls and redemption, about the peace that comes after suffering. But I kept thinking about the thing that had worn her face, the way it had smiled with too many teeth. Some things, I realized, don't find peace. They just find new ways to hurt. I handed the chief my resignation the next morning. He signed without looking up, his hand shaking as he wrote his name. "Maybe it's for the best," he said. "Maybe some things are better left alone." On the way out, I passed the evidence freezer. The door was ajar, and inside, on the top shelf, lay my flare, half melted but somehow intact. It was covered in a thin layer of white dust that shimmered under the fluorescent light as if alive. I reached for it, then stopped. The dust was moving, flowing in patterns that reminded me of circuit boards or neural networks. As I watched, it began to spell out words in a language I didn't recognize, symbols that made my eyes water and my head ache. I left the flare where it was and walked away. Some evidence is too dangerous to preserve. I drove south until the desert turned green, past cities where the lights stayed on at night, and the shadows behaved the way shadows should. I found work as a security guard at a shopping mall, watching teenagers steal candy and old men sleep on benches. Simple problems with simple solutions. But I never forgot Escalante. How could I? The memory lived in my bones, in the way I checked the locks twice before sleeping, in the way I avoided dark places and kept a flashlight by my bed. The desert had marked me, and some marks never fade. Sometimes late at night I still hear the radio static that sounds like voices calling from far away. Sometimes I catch glimpses of pale figures at the edges of my vision, moving with that same 32-inch stride. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, I hear Addie's voice whispering through the static. Riley, Riley, help me, I'm so cold. But I know better now. I know that some things that call for help aren't looking for rescue. They're looking for company, for someone to share the darkness with. And I've learned that the best way to help the dead is to let them stay that way. The desert keeps its secrets, and I've learned to keep mine. But every sunrise still feels darker than the night that tried to swallow me whole. And I know that somewhere in the slot canyons of Utah, something is still waiting, still hunting, still wearing the faces of the people it's taken. And sometimes, on nights when the static is particularly loud, I wonder if it's learned to wear mine too. I have not worn a badge since. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. Some hungers once awakened can never be satisfied. And some things that come from the deep places of the earth should never be disturbed. But they are disturbed, aren't they? Every day, people like me venture into the empty places, the forgotten places, the places where the old rules don't apply. They follow strange tracks and investigate unusual sounds, and most of them come back with stories that end up filed away in lockers no one will ever open. Most of them, but not all. The desert is patient. It can wait. And somewhere in the darkness between the rocks, something that was never human is still learning to be me. The end is just another beginning, and the hunt never really stops. It just finds new prey,